Hey there! Today we're going to climb what you might call the ladder of life. We're going to dig into how everything is organized, from the tiniest molecule all the way up to the entire planet. But as you'll see, the real story here isn't about the rungs on the ladder. It's about the energy that's constantly flowing through them. So let's jump right in.
So let's start with the big one. How is all of life even organized? I mean, at first glance, it just seems impossibly complex, right? But for hundreds of years, scientists have used a surprisingly simple model to get a handle on it all.
And this is basically it, the classic levels of organization. You start small with molecules, the basic building blocks. They get together to form cells. Then groups of those cells make up tissues, and tissues form organs that have specific jobs to do. Those organs work together inside an organism. That's you, me, a tree, a mushroom, and finally, all those organisms hang out together in huge ecosystems. It's a super neat, intuitive little hierarchy that's been a cornerstone of biology for ages.
Right, so this whole concept is what we call the levels of organization. The core idea here is really simple. It's all based on part-whole relationships. Things at a higher level are just made up of a bunch of things from the level right below it. It's a really powerful way to structure how we think about the entire biological world.
Okay, but this is where it gets really interesting. This neat, static ladder, this set of tidy boxes, well, it's kind of hiding a much more exciting, dynamic story. Because the one thing that truly connects all of these levels, the thing that powers the entire system, is the flow of energy.
So where does all this energy come from in the first place? Well, for pretty much every single ecosystem on this planet, the answer is exactly the same: the sun. The sun is the ultimate power plant, just bathing our world in energy day in and day out. The big question is, how does life actually plug into that power source?
And the answer is these guys, the producers. We're talking about plants, algae, some bacteria. Through this incredible process called photosynthesis, they literally grab sunlight and turn it into chemical energy, sugar basically. They are, and I mean this, the absolute foundation. They're the critical first step that brings all that solar power into the living world. Now for everybody else, you've got the consumers. From the rabbit that munches on grass, that's a primary consumer, to the fox that hunts the rabbit, a secondary consumer, and on up the food chain. All of them are getting the sun's energy secondhand by eating the organisms that came before them. And there's a scientific name for each of these steps, a trophic level. It sounds a bit technical, but it's just a more precise way to talk about an organism's job on this energy ladder. Producers are always at the bottom. That's trophic level 1, and the changes goes up from there.
Now you might be thinking that all the energy from the grass just gets passed right along to the rabbit, and then the rabbit passes all of that to the fox. But it turns out nature has a very strict budget, and it's governed by something called the 10% rule.
Let's just put this number out there: 90%. What does this represent? Well, here's the twist. It's not what gets passed on. It's what gets lost. That's right. A staggering 90% of the energy an organism consumes is not turned into more of that organism. It gets used up just to stay alive, moving around, breathing, keeping warm. Most of that energy just radiates away as heat. Think of it like a universal energy tax for the business of being alive. And this really shows the stark consequences. Just look at that drop-off. If the producers at the bottom start with 100% of the energy, the primary consumers that eat them only get about 10% of that. And the secondary consumers that eat them, they get just 10% of that, which is only 1% of the original energy from the sun. This is exactly why there are so many plants in the world, but way fewer top predators. There just isn't enough energy left at the top of the pyramid.
So we have this nice, neat pyramid, right? Producers on the bottom, consumers layered on top, and this predictable flow of energy. It's a great model. But you know where this is going. Nature absolutely loves to complicate things. The real world isn't always so neat and tidy.
So is it really that simple? Is life this perfect layer cake, or are there exceptions? Are there organisms out there that just don't quite fit into their assigned box? What about the rule breakers?
Okay, let's take a look at plants. We just established them firmly at the bottom of the food chain, trophic level 1, the producers. End of story, right? Well, think again. Meet the carnivorous plants. You've heard of them, the Venus flytrap, the pitcher plant. These are producers that are also acting like consumers. They're trapping and digesting insects, totally blurring that nice clean line we just drew. So what is going on here? So why do they do it? Well, the key here is to know the difference between energy and nutrients. These plants still get their energy the old-fashioned way, from the sun through photosynthesis. The reason they evolved to hunt insects is to get vital nutrients,
stuff like nitrogen and phosphorus, that are missing from the poor, boggy soil they usually grow in. It's a brilliant survival hack to get nutrients, not a new way to get energy.
And the rules themselves can change depending on where you look. On land, believe it or not, herbivores only eat a tiny fraction, like 3 to 7%, of all the available plants. Most of that plant matter just dies and goes to the decomposers. But in the water? Whoa, totally different story. Grazers, like zooplankton, are way more efficient, consuming about 1/3 of all the primary production. The whole energy flow is just fundamentally different.
All of these exceptions, the carnivorous plants, the massive differences between land and sea, they really force us to take a step back and rethink this whole idea of a simple, universal ladder of life.
So here's the big takeaway. That neat, tidy ladder is an incredibly useful model. It helps us get our heads around everything. But it's imposing a kind of rigid order on a reality that is wonderfully complex, interconnected, and, well, messy.
There's a much better way to think about this, from a philosopher of science named William Wimsatt. He suggested these levels are like local maxima of regularity and predictability. What does that mean in plain English? It means they aren't rigid, stacked layers. They're more like islands of stability in a really complex ocean. At the scale of molecules, things are pretty predictable. Same at the scale of cells. But the connections between those islands can be a messy, tangled web. The ladder is a useful map, but we should never mistake it for the actual territory.
And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. If nature isn't this clean, perfect ladder, but is actually more of a complex, tangled web with these pockets of order, how does that change the way we see the world and our place in it? It suggests that the simple diagrams are really just the beginning of a much deeper and way more fascinating story.